Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with New Role, the business-oriented podcast that brings the boardroom to you. I'm your host, Oliver, CEO of New Role, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Dimitri Chichlo, non-executive vice chairman and chair of the operations and digital committee at Ukreximbank, Ukraine's third largest bank. Since joining the bank's supervisory board in 2019, he's overseen its digitization and cybersecurity, latterly during the war in Ukraine. An expert in risk with particular focus on cyber, Dimitri was formerly head of risk at ING in Geneva, vice president of information security at Edmond de Rothschild, and senior information technology advisor at Union Bancaire Privée. He now runs his own consultancy practice and Secure. Dimitri, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Oliver, for having me. I'm very delighted to be with you.
So I'm really excited to have this discussion because it's a topic that comes up a lot. But before we get into how do boards manage cybersecurity risk, I was wondering if you could just help bring this topic to life a bit by highlighting what's at stake and talking about what happens when things go wrong. I'm sometimes surprised by how many board members are not attuned to what can be an existential threat posed by the issue. And I remember this really came to life for me at a talk by Jeff White, who's the author of The Lazarus Heist, which is about, as you know, the 2016 cyber attack on the Central Bank of Bangladesh by an organized crime group allegedly working with the North Korean government, where they used social engineering to penetrate the bank's cybersecurity defenses. I think they used a trick where they sent an email purporting to be a list of employees who were going to be made redundant. And they included in the email, it was a blank page where you had to click a macro in order to reveal the list. And they sent it to people, by accident, supposedly. And of course, people just couldn't resist opening that macro, clicking that macro, and they were in. But Dimitri, tell me about the times you've seen things go wrong in organizations because of cybersecurity failures.
So I live in Geneva in Switzerland, and that's the case of a window maker, a manufacturer, that was the victim of a ransomware, if I'm not wrong, in May 2019. And during 3 weeks, they were not able to produce to manufacture any window. And they lost all the production tools, the software that is used to design design the windows and manufacture them. Long story short, 1 year later, I think less than 1 year later, they went bankrupt. So the belief that we're not a bank, we're not an insurance institution is very wrong. In fact, we all rely on IT to do our job. All our companies rely on IT. We don't really understand that. I compare it, to a fish which lives in the water. As long as it is in the water, it doesn't realize by how much water is important. But as soon as you remove the fish from the water, then it suddenly realizes that that's absolutely essential. And that's the point I have today is we all rely on IT, but we don't really realize it as long as it works. And suddenly, when we have no IT working anymore, that becomes an issue. And the magnitude might be huge.
So that's a lovely image, and one that resonates a lot with me, as I feel like I'm only just beginning to grasp that magnitude myself and the scale of the risk. But one of the challenges is the risks are so omnipresent and beyond the resources of, to be honest, probably every organization that you've got to prioritize and have clear sort of risk frameworks in place because you can't do everything. How should boards be thinking about assessing and prioritizing that allocation? And you actually, we were talking just before, I had a really interesting point around understanding the motivations behind attacks as a sort of starting point for thinking about these risks. Just talk me through that.
Well, there are different motivations, right? We've heard, let's say, and there were recordings of people hacking, I think it was a police station in the US. And so the policeman started talking to the guy by the phone. And the answer was, I was bored. I was in my room. I was bored. So I started hacking you. And I mean, I was here. I mean, that I was just bored. And the policeman doesn't doesn't even get the point, right? It's feasible, so why not? But other motivations are, of course, more nefarious. You have, of course, cybercrime. I basically send a ransomware, I encrypt all your infrastructure, and then I just asking money to get my files back. So basically to get my encryption key, which with which I would be able to decrypt the files that were encrypted. And cyber criminals are making huge amounts of money out of that, especially because it relies on human error. You also have corporate espionage. And I remember talking to a couple, they've been working their whole life in a chemical laboratory. And so we were exchanging on this theme, explaining what I'm doing. And they said, well, I'm quite sure that our entire professional life, we've been working for a foreign government because we had almost no security in the laboratory. So we are quite sure as we were doing R&D and we were just offering our R&D to competitors, foreign governments. We don't exactly know, but we're quite sure that this happened. So you're basically investing a lot of money in R&D and you're just spilling this money, which is, it's scary. In terms of value destruction for a business, that's huge. State actors are also huge players. If you remember, on February 24th, the day the Russians started the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Viasat, which is a satellite that was used by, among others, the Ukrainian government for communications, Viasat was hacked and sort of deactivated at some point. So communicate, well, a lot of customers, but especially the Ukrainian government was not able to use Viasat to communicate. Well, it was attributed to Russia. It's quite, let's say, logical that is the case regarding the coincidence and the global geopolitical situation. But those are adversaries. On the other side, I take the image, if you drive a car and you got an accident, usually it's not that the tree crossed the road. It's probably you went off the road by yourself without any external help. You're drunk, you're tired, you're just not paying attention. And in fact, a lot of incidents happened internally because of a lack of organization or bad processes or just awareness of good practices. I saw that previously as a practitioner in banks. I see it today as a practitioner, as a consultant. The engineers are trained to deliver, but they're not really trained to deliver securely. So the task would be that they have to implement a network and an infrastructure, fine. So they would have a flat network, which is not segregated. So in principle, they've been delivering, right? But they've not paying attention to security, good practices, authentication, network segregation, etc., etc. And so this is quite interesting because very often you have this gap between security practitioners and IT practitioners, which should in principle work together. And the IT practitioners, CIOs and the teams, they should be aware of good security practices. So if you don't implement something, let's say secure, then you're going to have troubles in months or years. Let me take this example. Where, a car manufacturer doesn't manufacture a car without brakes, ABS, and a lot of security features. Security is embedded in car manufacturing. And if you want to buy a car, you even go on the NCAP website and witness the results of the crash test and buy your car depending on your risk appetite. So security is embedded, but not in IT today, which is quite scary at some point.
Really interesting. So I suppose looking at those different motivations behind the attacks and assessing it for your own organization as a board is pretty important to do, because that presumably then determines where the attacks are most likely to come from, or the nature of the attacks and what you need to be defending against. when we look at recent high-profile attacks, there seem to be quite a range of things that have gone wrong. Courtesy of ChatGPT, I was looking for some recent attacks, and the ones that came up with were the Equifax data breach, where it was attributed to unpatched software, weak security practices, where they didn't segment the network properly, so once the attackers got in, they could just move freely around, and weak password practices. The WannaCry ransomware, where they had unpatched systems, lack of system backups, and just inadequate security awareness, which made them vulnerable to social engineering. And the Target data breach, where they had third-party vendor weakness, insufficient segmentation again, and weak detection and response. So those are just a few, and there are a few recurring themes there. But what are the most common failure points that you see organizations exposed to?
Well, interestingly, the most common failure would be the lack of an inventory. My question is, how can you operate, and especially how can you protect something you don't know the existence of? If you remember the NotPetya ransomware, an attack that happened in Ukraine in June 2017, it all started in a very small company manufacturing a software used by all Ukrainian companies to pay the taxes. And the criminals went through a small server that was forgotten by everyone. It was completely under the radar. And so if you forget about those elements, you're just not protecting them. So I would say that that's the most basic failure that you would find, is the absence of an inventory, right? But well, the examples you gave us are very interesting. A flat network, I talked about it earlier, but a flat network is similar to, let's take the example of, well, a bank, right? Imagine that it's extremely difficult to enter the bank. But once you're inside, suddenly you have a similar to a huge open space where everything is on the same floor. The CEO's office, the accounting, the safes, the cash, payroll, HR, everyone, relationship managers, everyone is in a big open space, and there is no segregation between the desks and the offices. So basically, you can walk from the CEO's desk and grab the strategy for the next 5 to 10 years. You can go to the cash desk and the cash, etc., right? So if we segregate our buildings, our offices, this is also because of security and privacy. And so the lack of segregation, of course, has a huge impact, because if one part of your network is suddenly encrypted through a ransomware, it is going to spread all over the network. If it's segregated, then you can isolate the part of the network which is infected, heal it, but the rest of the network stays untouched. Lack of patching as well. So you have old software with vulnerabilities, and teams are not paying attention. And here it's really a question of process. Is how do I ensure that I get notifications from the vendors that a patch is available to these systems? And how do I ensure that I'm going to apply those patches to my systems? So this is a whole question of processes before being a technical stuff. Those are sort of examples, but user access management, of course, is also a huge vulnerability. So basically, how do I manage the keys to my office? That's the same. Does everyone have the key to everything? Or do I ensure that I have the key only to my office, and that's all? I mean, it's the same when you go to a condo. You have a key that opens only your flats and not all the flats, right? So that should be the same principle that should be applied in corporations.
Got it. So if I'm a board member listening to you now, I've just come into a new board role, and I want to understand, where this organization sits on the cybersecurity spectrum. And, let's assume it hasn't got anything. How should I be? What are the questions I should be asking, or what should I be doing to help them go on that journey? And in the first place, I suppose, understand the risks. So there are frameworks that you use when thinking about the organizations you're involved with, about understanding where the risks are and prioritizing them?
Well, interestingly, the first 4 months I spent when I was appointed at the supervisory board in 2019, I spent 4 months assessing the risks, assessing the operations. So I'm supervising operations in IT and cybersecurity. My first meeting was with the head of cybersecurity for the bank, and then with the head of IT and the head of IT, various IT departments. And I started asking questions about IT investments. How old is the equipment we operate in the bank? And I realized that we had very, very old equipment, like 10 years old, which is extremely risky because, again, it's not a question of attack and defense. It's a question of operating an old equipment that is out of life already. And if it gets broken, good luck to replace it on the spot. Right? So, just by asking some questions about the investment, about the organization, about the relationship between IT and the finance department or the CFO, asking question about how do you work with the cybersecurity team, it gives you a sense of by how much those guys are taken seriously by the management, or they're just, a fancy stuff, a fancy function somewhere offering you computers, but they're not really taken seriously. And here is a problem. Is that a lack of awareness from the management that considers that those guys are just like third parties? And let's give them some money to operate the IT, but that's not that important. Let's focus on the strategy and sales, etc. Or does the problem come from the IT guys? I have a cousin who works as an officer in general headquarters in the French army in Paris. And he told me, we had this discussion, he told me, I hate IT guys, but because as soon as they start talking to me and talking to us in meetings, they use very technical stuff. Everyone's lost in the first 30 seconds. And basically, we don't understand anything anymore from what they're asking. Probably what they're asking for is extremely important and genuine, but we don't really understand. So there is a problem of communication between the boards and the IT, or between management and IT as well. So IT is sometimes not able to convey the right messages. And so I think it's important, and I just don't understand how, especially large corporations, I think it's very important to have someone at the supervisory board, the board of directors, who is able to understand and speak the language and understand immediately the message that are conveyed by the IT and by the security guys. I think it's very important for board members to sometimes get out of the boardroom and talk to not even general management or executive, but senior management and -1 and -2 to get a sense from the culture that is inside the company. The boardroom, that you don't get everything at the boardroom, especially because you get the messages from the executives, and they might want to convey you the messages they want you to hear.
And what about where you're sitting on a board? It's a small board, and so you don't have room on that board for a specialist to be on the main board. So you're non-technical yourself as a board member. Is it reasonable to expect that person to sort of go out and start asking those questions? Can someone who is non-technical do that? Or what's your advice for them in that first instance when they're trying to understand, where an organization sits on that cybersecurity readiness scale?
Well, if you're really not technical, then you probably have to look for an external advisory. So advisory boards are, let's say, a part also of corporate governance. If it's a small entity, you might just ask for an audit, or get some advice from the outside. Form an advisory board in the fields you're not comfortable with, and those guys are going to advise you about the various topics, among others, IT or cybersecurity.
Okay, so So you've got to that stage, or as a board member, you've managed to get the organization to get a clear understanding of the risks, to prioritize them. What can you then do as a board to start to sort of counter those risks? And my own experience, I'm not super technical, but I've always, one of the first checkpoints for me is always, have they got any certification in place? If it's a small business, get their cyber essentials done, or their cyber essentials plus if they're slightly bigger, or ISO 2701, because that once I know they've done that as a board member, I at least a lot of the basic things have been covered. They will have done their pen testing, they will have put in place some sort of monitoring detection systems, they'll have started some sort of phishing program, they'll have started thinking about disaster recovery plans, they'll have built that sort of cyber aware culture, and they would have had to probably think about insurance. But what else can board members do once they've got that sort of landscape mapped out of where the risk is, to begin, responding to that? How do you think about it?
Boards must understand against which framework the company is managing its IT. Because at the end of the day, if you go through an IT security framework, it says how your IT is managed from a security point of view. So first and foremost, a company should adopt a certain framework. There are different ones, ISO 27, NIST, to name a few. And then according to this framework, the company can start managing the risks and reporting against the frameworks and explaining where, in terms of maturity, where the company stands and where the company should probably invest today to improve the cybersecurity posture. I think what is very important today in terms of security investment is the capacity to respond and recover. So for a long time, companies have been investing a lot of money in identifying and protecting assets. But we know that, in fact, it's extremely difficult to have 100% protection. If you want to have 100% protection, well, don't do any business, and then you have no risks. And sooner or later, you might be the victim of an incident, especially of a ransomware. So the question is, to which extent we are able to recover from such incident? Are we able to do that from the inside? Is someone going to help us from the outside? Do we have incident response teams? Do we have backups of data that we are able to use to recover from if the infrastructure is encrypted? So today, I think one of the important focus of the board of directors is, how is the company able to recover from an IT incident, especially from a cyber attack? Because if this is something the company is trained about, take the example of the firemen, right? They train and train and train and train. They will never encounter exactly the same situation they've been encountering when training. However, training will diminish the uncertainty by 70, 80, maybe 90%, right? And that's the same here. If the company is used to face an IT incident and recover from that, the more you trained, the easier it will be the day when you have an IT incident. Again, the incident might never be exactly the same you were expecting, but a lot has been done before to ensure that you're more or less ready the day the incident comes.
So is it fair to assume that essentially every organization will be breached? And is what you're saying that organizations just don't spend enough time on making sure that they can detect, respond, and recover to an incident versus avoiding it in the first place?
I think so, yes. I think in fact, you're hacked, right? You get a ransomware and some part of the network is encrypted. Yeah, fine, okay. If you have backups for that, if you've been trained by, cutting your network, recovering, ensuring the integrity of the backups and how to restore everything, you probably can spend less time on the protection because, well, bulletproof protection doesn't exist. I made the same mistake. I was very much focused on protection as well some years ago, and I realized that that's fine. I love illustrating my stories with jokes. You have two guys are walking in the forest, and then suddenly there's a bear in front of them. So the first guy thinks, I'm dead because there's no way I'm going to be able to run faster than a bear. And the second guy thinks, well, my task is to run faster than the first guy because once the first guy is caught by the bear, I have 100% chance to survive because he won't be interested in me. He will have enough food with the first one, right? So yes, I think if you protect quite well, you might be avoided by the criminals who are after you because, well, it's maybe too difficult to break into your network. But, well, sometimes human error happens and you might be breached. And then you have to be ready for this day and for this incident. Because
I can imagine that that's an area where it's very easy for the exec to say, yeah, we can restore things if we go down. But actually, that's probably where a board member can be very valuable, saying, show us, do it, and actually go through the discipline of actually doing it, when an exec might just think, well, we've got loads of other things we have to do. We know we can do that. And actually, when they actually have to, they suddenly discover some minor innocuous thing that actually prevents the whole recovery process. Is that something you see happening regularly?
One day I witnessed a business continuity exercise where everyone went to the site. Everything was well prepared. People come to the site, to the recovery site. So the scenario was the office burns. So we go to an alternate location. People come to the alternate location and they look at each other. Who's got the key? Oh, nobody. Okay, your exercise is failure. That's all, right? So you're going to learn from this. It's not a technical question. It's a question of process. Who's responsible for what? Where is the key stored? Where do I grab the key? How do I ensure that the day I need those premises, I'm able to get into, right? Remember the London bombings in 2007, if I'm not wrong. A lot of companies had their alternate location in the city, except that the whole city was, closed. And in fact, people couldn't work. So they learned from the mistakes. And so the more you train, the more you're going to identify your deficiencies, mistakes, and the more lessons you will learn, and the better you are going to be prepared for the future. So training in crisis management and training in such exercises is absolutely key.
Yeah, really interesting. Dimitri, I want to talk about one last risk that we haven't touched on, which strikes me as a sort of bigger risk than perhaps many organizations appreciate, and that's the board members themselves. What's very interesting to me is that many board members operate using their personal Gmail accounts. Yes. And they're receiving some of the most sensitive information to those accounts. They are accessing them through their sort of home computers, often not particularly technically savvy themselves. And a lot of the frameworks never actually, test the non-executives. Is this completely crazy, or am I missing something?
You touch a very important and interesting point. And this is something in cybersecurity we touch every day. It's the balance within usability and security. If I have 4 different mandates and every company insists on me having different devices for their company because they want to ensure that all the data remain on the device they own and they can control, security which they can control, they can wipe remotely, etc. This is going to be very difficult for me, right? I cannot carry 4 different iPhones plus my own one and 4 different laptops, for instance. And all companies might have a different setup. So I recognize a universal problem we have in security. We at least insisted on the board members switching to Proton mail service to ensure it's encrypted. At the end of the day, everything that is on Outlook's Microsoft servers or Google servers is not completely safe. You never know exactly. At the end of the day, those are American companies. If you have a judge ruling that data must be seized, these are American companies on American soil. There is no way you're going to be able to oppose to such decision. So at least we asked the board members to switch to, let's say, encrypted mail services. We stored our data on encrypted cloud services as well. And I give some recommendation to my board, to the fellow board members. Again, I recognize it's extremely difficult to have this versatility or flexibility, right? This is a very difficult problem to solve. And today, I don't think there is a platform that exists that helps managing everything like a service that it would be used by different boards and ensuring that everyone has the same infrastructure, which is, securely managed. Might be a business idea, in fact.
Brilliant. Before we move on to the wrap up, I just want to ask you one last question, which is for any board member listening to this, thinking about how they can help their board and organization become better with their cybersecurity, what 3 things would you want them to take away if they took nothing else?
Well, first, you have to recognize that it's not technical matter. It's a business matter. It's a business concern. It's not something that should be left to the IT guys. It is something that should be really managed by boards, by executives. If you leave those questions to your IT guys, to your CISO, cybersecurity responsible, you're definitely going to miss something. This is a business issue. It's definitely not a technical stuff. The second key takeaway is cybersecurity is very much about organization, about processes over technology. If you've been following on what happens on the battlefield in Ukraine, you've been witnessing that you cannot invade a country just with weapons and people and tanks. You need to have a whole chain of command. You need to have a whole strategy. You need to have support. You need to have maintenance. You need to have logistics. And only with this, you are able to go and wage a war. Because when a tank runs out of fuel in the middle of the road of nowhere in Ukraine, this is a failure of the whole chain, right? So organization processes over technology. Technology is just here to supplement everything you've been implementing on an organizational and process scale. And the third key takeaway is, I believe you really need some key expertise from the board, especially for large organizations. I'm not even speaking about listed companies. If you don't have this expertise inside the board, then you probably need, as external consultants, you can rely on or form advisory boards with specialists that can advise you on those topics.
Dimitri, I could keep asking you questions all day. Unfortunately, it's time to move to the wrap up, where I'm going to ask you 5 quick questions and where I'll ask you for a quick response, if that's all right.
Sure.
So first up, the best book every board member should read and why?
Cool. Well, I'm thinking about 3 books. Sorry. Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman, which is very much about decision-making. What You Do Is Who You Are, Ben Horowitz. This is about company culture. And Who Says Elephants Can Dance from Louis Gessner. It's an old book, but very interesting about turnaround situations.
Love it. I know the first 2, don't know the last. I'll add that to my list. Favorite quote and why?
Oh, I love Henlon's razor, that states, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity.
Love that. Best ever holiday and why?
I would say the one is coming, but probably the best memory I have is Myanmar in 2017 and the sunrise over Bagan is absolutely stunning.
Fantastic. And last but not least, your favorite podcast?
I very much enjoyed listening to Bad Blood, the podcast about Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes.
Brilliant. Dimitri, thank you so much. This has been absolutely fantastic.
Pleasure.
It's a topic I think lots of people would be really interested to hear about, and it's been amazing to benefit from your expertise. So thank you for taking the time.
With great pleasure.